Okay, so in this video, we're going to be finishing up communities and ecosystems, and we're going to be focusing on these last few questions. You need to be able to define succession and talk about how productivity, biodiversity, food web complexity, nutrient cycling, all of that change as you move through the stages of succession. We're going to look at what's the difference between primary and secondary succession. And then lastly, we're going to look at human disturbance interfering with all of these things, productivity, biodiversity, and so on. Okay, so let's go over to the PowerPoint. And just looking at succession, the definition is the orderly process of change over time in a community. So you remember, a community is all of the populations of living organisms in an area. And so that will change over time, usually resulting in some sort of climax community. So the communities will generally transition from what we consider a pioneer community, so kind of one of the first communities to move in after a disturbance or when there's kind of new, kind of bare rock available. It'll transition from that pioneer community to intermediate ones, finally to climax communities. And each of those community stages can be referred to as a seer. So you might see that, like the first seer is the pioneer seer, and then there's some intermediate seers, and then the climax seer. And if you remember from biomes, depending on the climate, will determine what is that climax community going to look like. Is it going to be a mature old growth tropical rainforest, or is it going to be a grassland or a desert? So you can have these climax communities that are of these different biomes. The ones we're going to focus on today is an example from up in Alaska, but it's kind of similar to where we are here. We would get some pretty similar differences, except we're going to be looking at a mostly coniferous forest, and this one is a mixed deciduous coniferous. And when we look at the communities moving through the seers, you get ones, they're going to generally become more complex as those that appeared earlier. So you see in those questions, we have to look at kind of how things change within the biodiversity and the food web complexity and the nutrient cycling. That tends to get more complex as you move from the pioneer to the climax community. All right, so here is the example. This is from Glacier Bay in Alaska. And we are looking at an example of primary succession. So primary succession is when you have succession happening from basically bare rock or sand. There's no soil there to begin with. And that can happen in a number of reasons. If there's some sort of like landslide down the side of a mountain, it takes all the soil with it, and there's no soil there, there's no biological footprint, that would be primary succession. If you get a new volcanic island, creating rock, that will start from primary succession. And this example is actually similar to how succession started in most of Europe with the retreat of glaciers. So when a glacier starts getting smaller and shrinking, where it doesn't exist anymore, so as it's receded and moved back, the area that's left behind is generally bare rock and gravel without any biological footprint, because there's not plants and things living under the ice. So this successional example is showing what the forest looks like as this glacier is retreated further and further north and left behind this area around Glacier Bay. So the glacier went away up here a long, long time ago. This is, and it's had time for succession to happen. Now it's in its climax community, which is this cool spruce forest. As you move further and further up in elevation and also away from this coastal area and north, then you start to get into the areas that the glacier has more recently receded. So they're in the later stages. So here is where it's just receded in 1941. So it's still in its earliest stages. This is the pioneer community. So this is the most recent land to be exposed. So the community that's there is in the very early stages. And this area here is the next, closest. That happened, that recession happened in the early 1900s. And so this is in a little bit later stage. It's a bit older. And then this one is a little bit older, and then finally this one has been glacier free for the longest period of time. So what's essentially we're modeling is that as time goes by, as this glacier recedes, the first community that moves in is this one, the pioneer, and then as it gets older and older, it should develop into this kind of shrubland community, and as it gets older and older and more time goes by, it'll probably be more of a deciduous kind of early pioneer forest, until finally it's old enough that it is the climax community of a mature spruce forest. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. First of all, you have to realize that the reason why it's changing from one community to the next is because the organisms that live in that community are actually changing the physical environment. And we know that species are adapted to certain tolerances. They can handle so much shade, they need so many nutrients. And as the organisms grow and develop there, they're actually changing the physical environment, which is changing who and what can live there next. And so they actually end up changing it, often changing it in a way that is beneficial for new organisms to move in, and then those organisms might outcompete the ones that were already there. They could shade them out, do other things, and so you see it slowly start to change until the climax community. So the very first organisms that are there, they start to change the physical environment. They put more nutrients down. They're getting a little bit bigger. They got some shade. They can hold some more water, and that makes it favorable for the next community to start to move in and become established. And when those new resources, the new nutrients and the new, water and cooler, all those types of things are available, that newer community can start to outcompete the original community that's there. And then they end up replacing it altogether through competition. So when we go through the different stages, you don't have to know every little detail about them, but you should be able to describe how these things sort of change as we move through the successional stages. You should be able to talk about productivity. So remember, productivity is the amount of energy fixed per unit area through time, per unit time. How does biodiversity change? How does the food web complexity change? And how does nutrient cycling change? Okay. And so kind of think about the general trends, and you'll see mostly everything is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. All right, so here's that pioneer community, that very first one. And so the glacier has just retreated, it left bare soil, and the first things that can move in are very hardy because they can tolerate conditions that don't have a lot of nutrients. They don't have, there's not necessarily soil. And some examples are lichen and mosses. Fireweed we actually see fireweed around here. If there's been a forest disturbance, you can see this plant come in. And other, like some herbaceous plants that can handle it. But notice we don't have any big trees. We don't have any big shrubs at this point, just basically herbaceous plants, lichen, and mosses, okay? So because there's not a lot of complexity here, there's not a well-developed food web. We might see a few loose food chains for a while, right? The gross productivity and net productivity, basically the general productivity is low just because there's not a lot of organisms there at that point. The diversity is pretty low, and the soil's not well developed. There's not a lot of decomposers to help cycle those nutrients back in. And with that little mineral cycling, we don't have a lot of nutrients there. So generally, our food web isn't complex. Our diversity is not complex. There's low productivity, and there's not a ton of nutrients available. However, as things start to die, and some of the decomposers that are there can start to, put those nutrients back down into the ground and start to form a soil layer, that starts to change the physical community. So some new species can start to come in. And so as that starts to change and you get a little bit of soil and you get some, the species can hold the water in on the soil to make it more available to other plants to come in, you start to see it change into this more like shrub type community. So these are kind of this intermediate shrub and maybe some small trees. And so, all of a sudden we've got a little bit more diverse habitat, right? So we've got more complex food chains. We've got higher productivity, increasing diversity. Okay, so there's more plants here. Obviously, there's more photosynthesis going on than there were in the one before. So that means there's a lot more productivity. If there's more productivity, that means that bottom layer of the trophic level can support more organisms. And if more organisms can be supported, then more diversity, more complex food webs. And of course, now the soil is really starting to develop. We've got more decomposers and we have more established mineral cycling. So again, deeper soil, better nutrients. The plants are going to be able to hold water better. There's more diversity, more productivity. Everything's all interconnected to each other. And of course, now the conditions are favorable for some larger trees to start to move in. So like birch and alder can start to move in, and you notice they're going to start shading out the ones out competing the individuals that were dominant in the last sear. And so we've got, again, richer food chains, higher productivity. You don't need to worry so much about GPP and NPP, but just in general, all of that productivity, that's especially that primary productivity of the plants, is really starting to mature, because there's plenty of plants that can photosynthesize, and you've got a lot more diversity. And look at the habitat diversity. That's going to be really diversified. And the soil starts to develop with more decomposers, and you've got more mineral cycling. Okay, so essentially that trend just keeps going. And there's this cool term that I like to bring up. You guys don't really need to know this for it, but resiliency. If you have a lot better diversity, more complex food chains, and really developed nutrient cycling, the ecosystem is actually quite resilient to change as compared to the earlier ones. And so they can weather some disturbances a little bit better than when they don't have so many connections and rich cycling. Okay, so we're still following the trend. Remember, all you really got to talk about is following this trend. Increased, diversity, higher productivity. Actually, let's start with productivity. Higher productivity, that means more carbon and sunlight energy is going to be fixed by the producers. That means there's more energy available to the next trophic level, means more energy is available to the next trophic level, okay? And so it can just support more organisms. So that means we're going to have more biodiversity. If we have more biodiversity, then that means our food chains are going to be more complex. And it also means that it can support more decomposers, which can help recycle all of those nutrients as things start to die or leaves fall. And so you've got these just a much more complex range. And that continues on as you move to the climax community. Here's with our spruce and hemlock trees. We look at these in what we consider a steady state equilibrium. This is kind of like as mature is what they're going to be, and they can kind of stay this way for long periods of time without disturbance. Complex food webs. We've got these things called case-selected species, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this chapter. But these are ones that are longer-lived species. Larger. It could be deer. You can get mountain lions and other things. And the productivity in general is very, very high. Don't worry about your GPP and NPP, but they're just your productivity is super high. And of course, we have the diversity is at a maximum. There's so much habitat, niche diversity, well-developed food webs. It's a stable climax community, okay? And soil is super mature. Sometimes the climax community diversity could reach an equilibrium as niches become filled. And if there's some competition, it could decrease. But in general, it is so much higher than all the others. So we're just going to be taking it as kind of this long-term trend, okay? And again, it's the most resilient because it has all of that complexity. I just wanted to show you a cool diagram or a cool graph showing you the soil nitrogen. And nitrogen, we know, is a limiting factor in a lot of places. And so look at how much available nitrogen is in the soil as you move through these successional. So here's the pioneer all the way up through the spruce. So the nitrogen is getting higher and higher and higher. And then you can see with this one, here's 4 different graphs showing things that happen. Look at the organic content differences. So much more in the climax community. In the moisture, moving all the way up So the spruce has a lot more moisture because you can imagine the trees are doing a lot of transpiration. They're pulling water, they're trapping the water, they're pulling it out from the soil, they're transpiring, and all that water kind of gets stayed and cycled within. Something that's really scary is if you start to deforest, you actually affect the water cycle because the large trees aren't able to kind of trap and cycle that moisture in the local area. So taking away the trees can actually cause a really terrible positive feedback loop in regard to moisture. This one is showing you nitrogen again. We looked at a similar one, and this is interesting, pH. I know everybody kind of is all worried when they want to test pH for some reason. They think, oh, low pH is bad. Well, actually, different plants are adapted to different pH soils. And you notice that the spruce is really quite a low pH for a soil. And the reason for this low pH, and this is quite low, is because the needles tend to contribute to a lot of carbonic acid on the forest floor. And so the species that live there are adapted to be able to live in more in lower pH conditions. So in coniferous forests, we tend to have a lower pH soil, and it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It's just what the soil is in those forests, unless there's some other factor of acid rain or something. But in general, you'll see this in a coniferous forest. Okay. I had mentioned that what we were looking at before was secondary succession or primary succession. So when there's no soil, no biological footprint at all. Well, we do also see a lot of secondary succession, and that's when there's some sort of disturbance, like a forest fire or maybe a clear cut, like you cut down some trees. So there is some soil left. So this is showing you this is a secondary succession where you have the forest fire going through. And it doesn't start from nothing. And so it can generally rebound a little bit faster because there are some nutrients trapped in the soil. And so you can often get regrowth happening pretty quickly, as long as it's left to its devices. So forest fires and other things can result in secondary succession happening after that because of a disturbance. Another thing that can happen too is something called deflected succession. Humans can actually keep ecosystems in a deflected state. So if through farming or, see this guy's mowing, keeping the grass down. So it could happen because we've introduced cattle and they're eating. If these were to be removed, I would imagine that the trees would start to come back in. So if he wasn't mowing this grass, I imagine this would then transition back to be more like a forest. And we deflect succession quite a bit. Now, it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes when we have this patchy kind of framework, it can support a lot of different species like nesting ground birds. And there are some species like elephants, right, that if they were removed from their ecosystem, a lot of the trees in the savanna would come back, and that would change the ecosystem pretty permanently, and it could lower the diversity for quite some time. So we can deflect succession through burning, mowing, grazing, livestock, and we keep it a little bit different from the pre-existing. And what happens is if we kind of have this permanent sort of deflected succession, the name of that is plagioclimax. Okay, so if you ever see that term, that just means it's succession that has been deflected and is in kind of a permanent state. Okay, and there's some examples and they've been established for a really long period of time, and for so long that even some of the birds and other things have evolved to appreciate that deflected succession. Okay, so I think that I have covered what we need to on that.